Okay, I am going to get us started, even though I think there'll still be people drifting in. But we have so much wonderful information to get to you, I don't want to lose a minute. So, you are in Seminar 3, Thinking the Unthinkable, or How to Prepare for a Platform Migration. If this isn't where you want to be, get out.
I want to be here.
But I promise this is where you want to be. Okay, so I'm just going to dive right in. I'm going to try to get through the intro stuff in fairly quick order, but if there's anything I miss, let me know. So our goal today is to give you in the room actionable insights into preparing for and managing a migration. We're going to start, the seminar is going to go through the publisher perspective. Then we're going to look at the librarian perspective, and then we're going to have time at the end for questions and open discussion, as well as a exercise, interactive exercise for your perspective as well. Just a quick overview of the agenda. There is a break at 9:55. That's a little bit earlier than the official break, but that's where it fit. So it's 15 minutes. If you need to hit the restrooms, you have to go all the way, turn right out of here, turn right again by the check-in desk, and keep walking almost until you would turn right again to get out, and then it's on your left. There will be coffee and snacks somewhere on this floor, probably also way back to where you came in. But I will ask you, we're getting out a little bit earlier than the official break, so maybe you'll have a leap on the bathrooms. And if you could get back here by 10 after so that we can launch into the second part, that would be great. I want to define some terms up front because we have multiple voices speaking here today, so just a note on those. In the context of this seminar, publisher will mean any entity or organization that has content that they need to host online. Whether I don't think we have any librarians here, but if we did and they were using an institutional repository, that would count. Societies, publishers, whatever you are. Librarian is meant to be a broad term inclusive of actual librarians at their institutions, consortia reps, even services who work closely with librarians like subscription agents. Vendor's a tricky one. When the publishers are speaking, we typically are referring to platform vendors or services vendors like our conversion vendors or our composition vendors. A lot of times when librarians say vendors, they may mean those people also, but they also mean publishers. So keep that in mind. And then platform is that thing we put our content on and the thing that their users come and consume that content from. It's a really broad term, so we'll just stick with that and clarify as needed as we go. And then real quick, what we mean by migration. So what we're going to be speaking to specifically today is a scenario of publishers moving from one platform and technology base to an entirely different platform and technology base. Now, that is certainly not what all migrations are. If you are a publisher who acquires an existing journal from another publisher, you really are migrating that journal to your platform, even if it doesn't seem like that. You may be migrating to a different version of your current platform. But just so you know where we're coming from today, this is about the whole shebang. So without further ado, I am going to kick into the publisher perspective part. Before I do that, any questions about facilities or logistics or anything else yet? Everybody on the Wi-Fi that needs to be? I think it's in your programs, also in the app. 2018. Aries 2018? Okay. Okay. All right, so, threw me me up here. We're going to be switching off throughout this. Carrie Kirkpatrick is with the American Physiological Society. She is the digital publications manager there. She has been there for 6 years. 5 years.
4.5.
4.5 years.
Lost track.
And prior to that, she spent 10 years in production at MIT Press in production and technology. And then I'm Allison Beelan. I am at Duke University Press, where I'm the Associate Director for Digital Strategy and Systems. And I've been there 14 years. 8 of those years, I was the journal's production manager. And both of us are speaking today because we are the people within our organizations who led the whole process, the creation of the RFP, the selection process, and then served as project leads for migration. And that would be our first key piece of advice. Make one person within your organization the lead and empower that person. Again, to give you a sense of where we're coming from, and so you can match our experiences to yours a little bit better, Duke University Press is a publisher, whereas American Physiological Society is a society that has publications. Duke Press publishes in the humanities and social sciences. American Physiological Society is in the biological sciences. I think that changes our experience migrating. A lot of these most of these platforms were built on STM journal article content. So if that's what your content is, it's going to fit probably pretty nicely into content models and technology. If you're bringing in humanities these days, it's still not quite the easiest fit, and especially if you're bringing in books, is sometimes not quite the easiest fit. And this can vary a little bit from vendor to vendor, platform vendor to vendor. And so we did bring books and journals into a unified platform, and American APS brought all 14 of their journals over.
Yeah, we do have 2 journals that we didn't bring over, but they are on the Wiley platform, so technically they're... Oh, sorry. Okay. So we do have 13 journals that we migrated over to Adapon. We had 2 journals that were on our old platform that we didn't migrate over, but those are hosted by Wiley, so those got migrated as a part of a separate migration project. So what I will talk about today is our experience with the 13 journals that I personally was involved in. So.
Okay. So just a sense of where we're going to go during this segment of the seminar. We're going to cover the planning process, everything you do before you kick into the project, organizing and management of the project, the post-launch period, lessons learned, and then hopefully have a good chunk of time for open discussion and questions at the end. I think I've got about 20 minutes if we stay on track. But we're going to be covering a lot of information in the presentation part that's at a fairly shallow level. If you see something that you want to know more about, don't hesitate to throw your hand up or just ask a question. This is a pretty small room, so I can hear you. Okay, before we go any further, I want to just get a sense of who's in the room. By a show of hands, who is in that category that I defined as publisher? Okay, okay. Keep your hands up, keep your hands up. Okay. Keep your hands up if you've done a migration in the last 5 years. Okay. So there's some folks who've been through it here. I invite you to share your experiences. Now, please raise your hand if you're in the services and vendor and technology sector. Great. Thank you very much for coming because, one, I think you'll be interested in what both groups have to say, and 2, we want to hear from you whether we've taken away the appropriate lessons learned and what, given your experience on hundreds of migrations, we might all need to know. I will say that the purpose of this is to give you actionable insights. This purpose is not to get into why anyone migrated or why they migrated from where they migrated to where from and to where. This is not about comparisons, so if you're here to get the dirt, there's not going to be any dirt. We're just going to be sharing our experiences. You ready? This does work.
Okay. All right, so we'll just dive right into the planning portion. And planning ahead of time for a project like this is such an important part of the migration project. And the more time you have to plan, the better. And I'd like to outline some of the pre-migration tasks that we performed at APS. Probably the most obvious is to set up your budget so that you have the finances to pull off a project like this. Migrations are expensive, and unexpected costs will creep up throughout the process. We also hired a few staff members to beef up our digital publications department. We realized that when we were conducting an RFP about 5 years ago, that even if we wanted to migrate to a new vendor, we just didn't have the human power in-house to do it. So hiring those extra bodies was really helpful for us. And if you're looking to hire extra staff, some of the qualifications that you might want to look for are the XML expertise, someone who's good with emergency fixes, who doesn't mind receiving a large list of files to fix and resupply, web design experience, someone who can liaise with marketing to help construct a communication plan, and really just having those extra people who can speak web language or digital publications is really helpful. I would also recommend hiring a consultant into your budget if you can. APS had one that helped us through the RFP process, and then we also hired one to help us through the actual migration project as well. It really helps to have that third party who can help keep everyone on task during this huge migration.
Just a quick note in comparison, Duke Press didn't hire a consultant for this process. We had worked with several consultants for a couple of years prior, not really around migration, but around defining our business strategy and our strategy toward our content and our technology and how we wanted to go about digital. So we drew on a lot of what we learned doing that into our search process and didn't really have a consultant on the RFP, and then didn't have one in the project management role helping with the project itself, but that's largely because I was able to be almost completely I was the consultant. I was able to be completely dedicated, and where I sit in my organization, I almost, even before the migration, I almost serve as that neutral party, neither books nor journals, neither editorial nor production. So I was able to serve that role in my particular organization. But if you don't have that neutral voice in there, it can be extremely helpful to have that consultant role.
Yeah, and because APS hadn't performed a migration in over 20 years, and I had only been there for 3 years at the time, and I had not gone through a migration, so the consultant really helped me as well. Kind of go through the motions and make sure we were all staying on track, because we were all kind of flying blind throughout the whole process. So it was nice to have somebody who had done migrations in the past and could really help us with our path. So start cleaning. Another project on our plate was to start building an in-house archive of our content. All of our files were housed on our old platform, and we didn't have any backups in-house. And if you have the archive at your disposal, you can also start cleaning up your metadata ahead of time. And if you do dig into your metadata, you will find it's kind of messy. And if you have that in-house archive, you will also be prepared to hand off that content to your new vendor early, which will be helpful in saving time down the road.
If you don't have your content as files on a server that you own, get it now. Don't wait until you think you might be migrating in a couple of years. Get it now. Yeah. I think when we all started in this, and we were also with the same platform for 15 years, we're like, oh, our archive is
There.
There, the site. You can't download that. We had 35,000 articles. You can't download that article by article by
We
article.
had 165,000 articles.
So this is just something that we realized, fortunately, a couple of years beforehand, and we worked with our platform to get all those assets delivered back to us then, and then put an ongoing archiving plan in place so that we always had those assets. If you don't have that, do it now.
Good point. We also conducted a survey asking our users and stakeholders about our current journal site at the time. What did they like? What didn't they like? What features they would like to see us implement in the future. We already had a list of those features that staff had wanted over the years, but this user feedback helped us shape our wish list. When you're looking for that perfect fit in a vendor, you want that vendor who can fulfill your requirements, but also you want someone who can fulfill many of those features that you want to see on your site. The biggest or lengthiest pre-migration project is the request for proposal that has been brought up already, but it's the actual search for the vendor that's the best fit for you. Through this process, you create a document of questions that you want prospective vendors to answer. And those questions are such as questions about their business structure and practices, features they offer and what's on their roadmap, subscription management practices and tools they offer, technology infrastructure, pricing, et cetera, et cetera. So it can get really involved. So what we did was we sent out a separate RFP to our current vendor because we had a completely separate set of questions we wanted them to answer. We then used the completed RFP and recommendations from other publishers to select our finalists. And this is an aspect I'd like to mention that it's super important is if you're a publisher, don't be shy about talking to fellow publishers about their relationship with their vendors. This will help you gather your list of perspectives and also give you further ideas about what to ask in your RFP. The finalists were then invited to APS to give presentations about what they think they would, who they think would be the best fit. All of this information was then used to score each vendor based on a number of different criteria. The end of this process will involve some back and forth and then the final selection, which of course is followed by contract negotiations with the vendor you choose. And there will be a separate slide here to talk about our timeline for that. Okay.
Oh, didn't go well. Sorry, that's not very readable.
But so here is the timeline. We actually took pretty much a full year to complete the RFP. We drafted the RFP from January through July, and then we hired a consultant that could help us kind of finalize that RFP and manage the distribution and organization process. Then July through September was basically distribution, answering questions from those vendors, and then receiving the completed RFPs back. September and October were evaluation and coming up with our short list of vendors. And then October was the presentations from the finalists. October through November was scoring those finalists. And then the selection, and then November through December was basically used for contract negotiations. And then we actually signed our contract in January of last year.
And again, in contrast, at Duke, we went a slightly different route. I call it the no RFP route. That's a little bit of a misnomer, but I mentioned that we had done a couple of years of work really deep diving into what we needed to be doing as a publisher and a press and what our real core business strategy was and what our digital portfolio needed to do to support that. So we had a lot of documentation. I basically contacted the vendors that we knew we wanted to hear from. We went under mutual non-disclosure agreements, and then I used Basecamp to mount all of those documents and to invite them to engage with those documents and then to come and present to us. So without specific questions yet, without specific requirements, a couple of things that did. One, it gave us a sense of how enthusiastic and engaged in how deeply each platform vendor engaged with our material. Two, we were looking for the long haul. We didn't want to do this again in 5 years. So we were not looking for, can you do these 6 specific things that we know right now in 2016 we want to do? We were looking for a methodology that would support us over time, an approach to technology that would support us over time. So for us, it was more important to suss that out first than to suss out specific things that they could or would do with our content. And that might be because we have such a scale of content and it's very diverse. It may be if we were a publisher, a society with a more focused content set, we would be more concerned with, can you do this specific thing we know we need to do? And our process was, on paper, a little bit shorter. But again, it was backed up by this couple of years of pre-work. So in June, I built that document set. July was contacting the vendors and going under NDAs. On-site presentations over August and September. Just talking with finalists and following up with them in October. In November, selecting the preferred vendor, and that's when we really dug into what we did have as lists of requirements. And then contract negotiations in December, bleeding into January. I would much have preferred to have the timeline that Carrie had. We were pressed on our timeline this entire time, so I don't really think we or our vendor got our feet under us in the project until February, and then we launched in on November 20th. That was really tight. So you've got your RFP. You feel really great about it, but what you don't want to do is sign that contract, put out that announcement to all of your customers and your members, if you have members, saying, hey, we've got this great new partnership, stay tuned, only to then hear from them, oh, is your platform going to do this, 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 and this? And you go, oh, no, I didn't even ask. So ask your customers what they care about. You may think you know, and my team, my library relations team, knew a lot, but we had a sense of how important accessibility was becoming at the time. So we had that in there, but if we hadn't, these kinds of things are so foundational that if you don't have them in an RFP and get a commitment from your selected vendor at the RFP stage, you're not going to be able to force it in later. You probably can't afford to pay for it on your own later. And you will be left to, just whenever does this come up on their roadmap. So if librarians especially know what is important and what they need, and you may not know all of it. You may not know what their priorities are. So be sure to ask and get them in your RFP. And I can't remember if you did this, but we set up a library advisory board. So this was about 10 to 12 librarians from different parts of the library who we know are involved in managing access and content. And they were our sounding board. Whenever we had a question about, would it be better if we did this or this? That's who we asked. How should we go about talking about this thing? That's who we asked. When it came time to launch and we needed people to kind of come in and check things, that's who we asked. And really, it was invaluable to have that.
We didn't do that, but we wish we would have done that. So I would definitely emphasize how important, something like a focus group with librarians or advisory board or whatever you want to call it, I would get them involved. We didn't do it enough. We had questions about these things in our RFP, but not in depth, and it didn't go beyond that. So I would definitely get them involved.
Yeah. And also remember, I've got GDPR up here. It's been coming for 2 years, but who among us was really paying attention? I wouldn't have known to say anything about this in the RFP. So that, again, is where it's really good to get a sense of how your chosen partner plans their roadmap and deals with things that pop up like this, because you're not going to be able to predict everything. Okay. So we're actually a couple of minutes ahead before we get into the project organization. So I just want to open the floor for any questions or comments or observations from your own experiences around planning. Yes. Could you tell us who you are? Glenn, I'm sorry, this is being recorded. So Glenn Landis with ASH, yes.
Yes, can you just speak more about the practicals about the library board? Did you meet often? You're comfortable?
That's actually going to be for me. Yes, so let me introduce a little ahead of schedule. Kristen Twardowski, she is my colleague at Duke Press, and she works on our library relations and sales team.
And the question for those of you watching via WebEx or at home was, what were the logistics of our library advisory board? How often did we meet? What did that look like, et cetera? So our library advisory board, like Allison mentioned, was 10 to 15 or so librarians from varying institutions. These would be small colleges. We tried to have, a community college as well as a large research institution, and a few international as well as U.S.-based institutions as well, to get a good variety of experiences. We never met in person except for small groups at various conferences, but we did have very frequent email communications. We tried to loop those into every 2 weeks. We would send a question to the large group and give them a few days to answer. They could all see each other's feedback, and they would respond to each other's comments as well. These questions could be, as small as, what do you guys think of as accessibility, or in terms of what do we need to do for accessibility? Or it could be really detailed things about metadata, what kinds of back-end programs and ILS systems they used, et cetera. So that communication was pretty regular, I would say May through September. So this is when we were still in the planning phases, really, of our platform migration. Building phases of the platform migration. But as we got closer and closer to launch, we tried to loop them more into testing. Like Allison said, we launched on November 20th, and preparing for that, we asked our librarians, I know this is around Thanksgiving, can you guys respond if we check this link, see if you have access, here are these different types of content, we want to see what that looks like on your end. And they were very kind enough to send screenshots and things like that. Mm-hmm. And we've been following up with them after migration as well, though it's been less frequent since things have settled down the past couple of months.
Yes. Rose from Elsevier, thank you.
So I was wondering if you also had a similar group of end users to test the usability of the platform,
So the question is, did we have a similar advisory group with end users? And I'll answer first and briefly and then turn to Carrie. So we have a few society journals, but not many that are members. So that doesn't mean we can't do usability testing, but we didn't have a baked-in population. We did not do that specifically for this platform build. What we had done, some of the activities we had done in those previous couple of years of planning had been usability studies, developing personas, doing some focus groups and interviews, and we took all that into our planning. But we also, for economics' sake, took the basic interface of our platform partner and said, we're going to take that pretty much wholesale as you have it built. We knew what other publishers were using it. We trusted those publishers. And I'm not saying this is the way to go, but I think one thing to recognize at this point in the evolution of digital publishing and platform building, unless you are literally building your own, you have your own designers and your own developers, as long as you're working with one of these platforms, a lot of this UX stuff is just settled. And unless you have a big budget to customize what they've got, you're going to take to a large degree what they have figured out and done through their usability testing. Does that mean it's perfect? No. But we knew we couldn't afford to to change some of those user flows. And where we did have specifics, we took that into the design planning process with them.
Yeah, and this is jumping a little bit ahead. It's not part of the planning, but we did not involve like outside end users in the testing. Our platform allowed us to sort of imitate users, so we became too reliant on that function to be able to test outside users using that function. And you know, you're just so harried at that point in the process that, you know, organizing this big end user testing phase, it's just, you know, it would take a lot of effort. And so, you know, and at the end of this project, you know, you're just so pressed for time, and a lot of times that testing time is eliminated because you're trying to hit launch. So
yeah, I mean,
unfortunately.
I think the truth is that, well, there's two parts. There's like, did you do your usability testing to inform what you want to build? So we did. Then there is, okay, you've got your beta site, you're not yet launched and live yet. Are you bringing people in to test? The truth is we ran out of time, and I'm not saying we don't have time. We could have given ourselves more time, but we didn't. We had a contracted date by which we had to get off the old platform and have the new platform in use, and we just flat out didn't have the time. Two, everything's done by then. By the time somebody can come in and have a halfway coherent user experience, you can't go back and undo it. Maybe you write down some things and you put that on your own roadmap and budget for it for the next year after you launch, but you aren't gonna 1 or 2 months before you launch go in and be like, I really don't like the layout of articles. It didn't work for people. Let's rip that up and build it again.
There were no prototypes in advance, right?
No, well, there were, so yeah, you're right. So to a large degree, we kind of looked at the sites that were live. Several of the platforms now have sort of brand new versions of their core interface, so it can actually be a little bit challenging to find a live example of these, especially one that you think fits your publishing organization. I mean, over time, more and more publishers will adopt these newer interfaces, and you'll have that. So yeah, we did have that, and did we put it in front of people? No. I wish we could have. Yes.
Michael Dar from the ACS.
ACS, thank you.
I had the experience. It wasn't for a migration, but I did some like focus group testing for a taxonomy.
Mm-hmm.
You basically can add like 2 to 3 months to your timeline. Like it was way longer than I thought it was going to take. Because part of it's just recruiting people to do it. No one wants to do it for free typically. Then you got to do incentives to get them to do it. So.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard, and and it's not our core business. It's not even, I'm in charge of this, and it's not even really my core business. It should be, but it's not. So I'm going to move on now, but these are all great points and questions. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about project organization, and this is going to be a little bit of here's how we did it, here's some tips. First of all, these are big projects, and they are not a singular project. And so we absolutely had to break it down into smaller components. We broke it down into these 4 components. We had the site build and design, content migration, data migration, and partner communications. I wish we had had a 5th sub-project dedicated to content workflows. And those would be the people who, after we had figured out 1 and 2, like how the content needed to be tagged and produced, what the final spec was, and how it all fit into the site, we needed a team that could document all that and begin to work with our composition and data vendors to get those new workflows into place ahead of launch, and we didn't. So again, I strongly advocate for placing a project lead and putting them in place. I was dedicated about 80%. My actual role allows my organization to do that with me, so that was great. Carrie, can you speak to how you all?
Yeah, very similar. My role was pretty much about 90%, I would say, because I was all of these things, and then I had, a couple of people who were core members of the team, and then committees kind of within committees. So I did have help, but I was that project lead, and it took about 90% of my time, if not more.
Yep. And so my core team consisted of people from across the organization, customer service, library relations and sales, marketing, journals marketing and book marketing, and so editing, design, and production. So there were team leads on each of these. On these, sometimes there were co-leads. So for site design and build, we had our book marketing and our journal marketing managers as co-leads. And then they pulled in resources and formed their own teams. I, as project lead, dealt with the team leads. And that worked pretty effectively for us. They dealt with their departments and their teams. I think, what's key with the team leads, and if you are picking a core team, you need people on there who understand the business, who are comfortable making fast decisions, and who are trusted to make those decisions within their group. This is not something that will work by consensus, where every time you have a question that needs to be decided, you take 2 weeks to poll the whole group and to hash out the responses and to come to a conclusion. Then there's this whole other team you need to organize and manage, and that's your vendor team, and there are a lot of them. If you're moving from one platform to another, you're almost certainly going through some kind of content conversion process, from whatever the previous platform spec had been to a new target spec. Some of the platform vendors offered to do this or manage this as a service. We got a third-party service, so we ended up working in this very tight triangle for content migration between our content conversion vendor, our platform vendor, and us. That was tricky because when things go off schedule or cost more money, you, the publisher, are really left holding the bag, because you're not going to win in an argument between the two vendors about whose fault ultimately it was. But for us, it did work pretty well. With your new platform partner, you need to come to understand what their team roles are, what their project methodology is, how the project and the team is going to be governed, what escalation paths do you have, when something's not going right, who do you talk to, what are your ways of staying in regular communication about that. Don't forget your retiring platform vendor. It's really imperative that you be clear with them about your timelines, to the degree that you know them. You've got to understand your obligations to each other, notification periods, contract end dates. You might have to talk with them about some contingency planning if you aren't able to launch your project before the contract end date. Do that when you're signing your contract with a vendor. Talk about what that exit looks like a lot more than vendor will hand you your assets. And beware that they're not working for free. Just because they've been your partner for years doesn't mean they're going to put out hours of labor. You're going to pay if you need to get assets back from them, if you need to get data delivered from them. So you've got to budget for that also. But it's really important to be open and clear with your retiring platform vendor. And then you also have your composition and your data vendors who, one of them may be your conversion vendor for the migration, but may not be. All of them eventually have to get up to speed on what it is going to look like to deliver content tagged properly to that new platform, and manage all that with you. And again, this is a place where I wish we had done better. This is one of my big lessons learned. So scheduling. This is going to get I'll try to keep it from getting geeky. This is close to my heart. I do not have a Gantt chart, so count yourselves lucky. Okay. So if I boiled down the scheduling method, it would be know your launch date. There are several steps to that. I guess know when you have to be off your current platform and make sure your launch date is in a good position on the calendar with relation to that. Go ahead and back your launch date up. Know what date you actually have to be up by, and then back your launch date up. Back it up a month. Back it up as far as you can back it up. Then you need, I talked about all the different project subparts. You need to find the least flexible process within that. I think most of the time, I haven't been through a ton of migrations, but I think most of the time that least flexible process is going to be the site build and the migration, everything that goes into the technology of building the site. So if that's the case, set your schedule based on that. Then all those other efforts, data cleanup, content, especially content conversion, need to align to that schedule. And that means you are telling your organization, your other vendors, hello, here's this time box. I know it may not be enough time to do this, but that's how much time we have. And then everybody needs to understand what that means. You as a publisher can't set a time box that on some level you may know is not adequate to get all of your content perfect and expect it to be perfect. You're going to have some sense of where you're going to make compromises. On the content side, it may be that you just kind of have to give up and gloss over on some of those metadata inconsistencies. Or on the site building side, you know which features you can launch without if you have to. So, you start off with a schedule and you think, how complicated could it be? There's the calendar, there's your launch date. Sure. But then remember, you've got these multiple projects. You've got a site build. You've got a data migration project. And data migration, let's be clear, this is who are your customers? What are your products? Of your products and your customers, who has what? And then what are the rules around all of that? You may also have data migration related to usage data, either your publisher usage data or your counter usage data. I will say we totally punted on migrating counter data. Very soon after we announced that we were going to be migrating in a year, we let our customers know that we were not migrating counter data and that they should take all actions necessary to download and build whatever kind of archive they wanted to have. Part of that was because our previous platform allowed for overlapping IP ranges, as did our practices with our backend system. So we ended up with a lot of different accounts that really represented maybe the same institution. And counter usage was associated with each of those accounts. Well, with the new platform, we couldn't have overlapping IPs. So part of our data migration project was doing this huge deduplication and consolidation process with our customer database. And that was going to mean that we could not do a one-to-one transfer of, customer A's counter data over to customer one's counter data here because they were going to be different accounts. I don't know if that made any sense, but know if you have to dedupe your customer data. And then you have the content migration. So you kind of instinctually know that all of these need to come to fruition at the same moment, but that is too simplistic. Quick preview. Another calendar that you may not be aware of. A lot of the platform vendors these days are working on some version of an agile methodology, and that means that they work in sprints. Some have 2-week sprints, some have 3-week sprints. I know ours, the whole company operated on the same sprint schedule, so those sprints were not for our project. So you need to be aware of that, how that works, and what that means for when you will see the outputs of each sprint, and when you can review it and how much time you have to get feedback to them. And it also matters because if you know you've got a milestone related to one of these projects and the only way to sort of see it is on the site, you have to know when the site's going to be ready for that. So the whole point of this is just that this is complicated and you need to get it down pat as soon as you can. So again, I needed to get a visualization out there for the team. So I started with the least flexible process, and that was the site schedule. You can see I represented the sprints in there, as well as roughly each period where we would have a chance to review what had just gotten released and to give feedback. So this is not the tool I use to manage the schedule as the project manager. It's the tool I use to communicate to the team and their teams when they were going to be on deck to do what. And I aligned everything to the launch. Then I layered in the points of intersection with the other major projects. One major project being the content load, the converted content load, and the ready for data load. So these are the points where the site was going to be ready to import all of that content that had been converted on that parallel content project. So that was the other timeline I had for the content team, is what was going on in that full-fledged gigantic project to convert 2,500 books and 35,000 articles, and where did these two things need to intersect and align. So I think it's really important when you have these sub-projects with team leads that everybody is working off of one map. Even if they're not getting absolutely every piece of information they need out of it, it's good. You have to have this touchstone. And then finally, this isn't really sort of about project planning and organization. No matter how much you planned your RFP, you are going to hit some hidden shoals. And I found two rough categories of these. There are things that your old platform just handled out of the box. Maybe it got figured out 15 years ago. Nobody ever wrote it down. Nobody is around anymore to tell you why they made that decision. You don't even know it's happening. So those are your black boxes. Shibboleth was one of these for ours, just something that got taken care of. Well, suddenly we're being asked, do you have a relationship with the Shibboleth Federation? Are you a member? I don't know. I had no idea.
That happened to us too.
Did I even think to ask? No, I had a vague requirement about, can handle Shibboleth authentication. Abuse monitoring configuration, black box, was asked, how do you want us to configure this? What level of use should trip somebody being kicked off the system? I don't know. How many clicks are legitimate clicks? Just there's a lot of stuff that once you are in a stable state on a platform just works for you and you're going to lose sight of them. So when you're migrating, all of that stuff comes up. Then there are the things that you know some stuff about, but probably not as much as you should. I think the most complex set of choices you're going to have to make here are around the identity and access integration approaches. I think some platforms basically say, here's how you do it, get all your data in shape. Other platforms are open on that and work with different levels of integration with your own backend system. So just even knowing how to assess the pros and cons of different approaches, we didn't know enough to even know what the consequences of our choices were. You may be aware that your data is not in the greatest shape, but you may not be. And then there's the deep, deep business rules, the things that, you ask your product people, your library relations and sales people, your subscription product people, how do these products work? And they can tell you in a sort of absolutely accurate anecdotal way, but not in a way that your vendor can build logical access routines to. There's also, again, 15 years on the same platform. We had lost institutional knowledge. There were all kinds of metadata surprises. We found about 6,000 articles that had DOIs on them that had never been deposited and registered to CrossRef. Carrie, I think you found.
We had that. We also had, 6,000 PubMed records that didn't link back to our content for various reasons. So, I mean, these are the surprises that pop up. And also another sort of broad piece of advice about this is talk to us. Like, talk to people who have gone through this before, so you get this advice about these black boxes. That's the best way to get advice on how to do these things. So.
Yeah, I almost wish, I mean, maybe we can do this. I'd like to build a Google spreadsheet of all the different black boxes we've all encountered and the surprises along the way that, just grows over time. And maybe one day we'll cover the whole spectrum, but I doubt it. Okay, we have just a couple minutes. Any questions on that material?
Crystal clear.
Yeah. So I'm particularly interested from people who are with the platforms or the content conversion vendors that are in here, or even CrossRef. Any hints or tips? Yes.
And hold on, let me bring a mic to you.
Hi there, so I'm Amanda, I'm from CrossRef. So yeah, I agree with so much of what you've been saying earlier, particularly about planning in advance, and the surprises of what you think you're registering with CrossRef compared to what you're actually registering with us. So one of the big things we've heard from our members is to do an audit up front of what you're registering with us, because it might be a bit of a surprise. So
I didn't even know we could do that.
Yeah, exactly. Or we thought we were registering this type of content, references or abstracts or ORCIDs or whatever it might be, and actually they haven't been registered by your current vendor when you thought they were being. So to start with, probably the best thing to do is just to get an audit up front as early as possible. And I know members we've spoken to who've done this recently have said they really, really didn't want to do it with everything else that was going on. But further down the line, they discovered at the implementation stage they had to do one anyway, and they really wish they'd done it up front. So definitely start with that to begin with. We've got a new tool that's in beta at the moment, it's not yet live, called participation reports, which can show you what you are and aren't registering against 10 key data points. As I said, not yet live, but if anybody wants a sneak peek, we've got it at our stand downstairs for the conference, if anybody wants a little bit of a sneak peek. Plus, we've got, we're about to put on the site a checklist of things you might want to put in your RFP. So again, a lot of members have said they put in a line in their RFP around works with CrossRef or registers content or what have you, and obviously all the vendors will tick that box, but obviously there's a very big difference between just registering DOIs with very basic metadata and actually registering full, rich metadata to make sure you're as discoverable as possible, taking part in all of our services, etc., etc. So we've got this new checklist which will be coming in the next couple of days that you can just cut and paste so you can ask those kind of specific questions. And the final thing to say is that just finally your single project lead, yes please, and particularly working with us, that would be really helpful.
All right, so when you leave and get back to your organizations after this week and you start collecting your content archive, then immediately audit it. Then you're set.
No, okay. I think I saw a blue hand up first.
Hi, Jacob with Adapon. I'll be quick. Just want to say one additional item to add to the list that you just said. When you make that content archive in advance, which not all publishers do, and I wish they all did because it's so much faster if you do that. There's another thing to check for, which is every article that you've had in past years or book chapter where something wasn't rendering quite right and you called up the vendor and said, could you fix how that's rendering? You need to check, did they actually fix it in the underlying XML or did they kind of fudge it in the HTML? Because if they did only in the HTML, that's not necessarily going to convert over. You might have to, what I unofficially call relive your sins as you convert
Yeah.
over. What do you?
That is exactly what this is about. It's anything that you fudged in the display layer goes away. And again, if you've been on the same platform for a long time, there have been different best practices over the generations of online publishing. And what we found is that with our new platform, so much is driven out of the XML. And if it's not in the XML, and if it's not there to drive that, what you want to happen on the display side, there's no like magic tool that they've got that's going to make it happen. This is especially true around subject collections, categories, anything that, you know, you're like, I want someone to be able to do this that's outside of the straight journal article flow. You may have done it in through an outside database, a relational database. You may not know that, but that may be how you did it. It's not represented in your content. So, Bernie, go ahead.
Another point I'll make as well is, when you find those problems with XML that aren't rendering on the new site, don't be afraid to ask for a report, because a lot of times the vendor can run a script, and so you can get the full report of exactly how many instances of this problem there are. A lot of that might be a surprise. There may be thousands. There may be only 2, but definitely ask for those reports and have them run scripts to give you the full shebang about that.
Yeah, we did that a huge number of times with both our data conversion vendor, our content conversion vendor, and our platform. Bernie.
Bernie Stukenborg with Sheridan and Sheridan Pub Factory. Not anything about the technical, but about this process. I just want to say a few things. The way Allison did the non-RFP is the best RFP. You shared those business documents with me also, Allison. What that did was it gave the service provider the opportunity to look into the business, their strategic objectives that were, that Duke was after. That's what this is about. If you got 64 questions for your service provider, and they're real questions, ask them. But the standard 64 questions that maybe you're never going to read those responses, don't worry about those things. If you have the right collaboration, this can be better. And Duke ended up with a beautiful site, okay?
Thank you.
And through this process, the whole thing, because of this kind of collaboration, this thing works. This is a lot of work, and you guys are doing a great job of explaining that. So for everybody in the room who's kind of considering these things, this is just a great example and a great approach. Mm-hmm. Your service provider should partner with you and make this process better. It should make your life so much better if you are collaborating in the right way. So nice work on all that.
Thank you. Okay, so we're going to move on, and again, we have more time at the end. I'm going to hand the main mic back over to Carrie. I'm going to grab this, and you can.
Okay. Sure. All right, so post-launch. So we had a countdown clock to launch day in-house. We were ready to party. We had started to schedule vacations that we had put off for the last year. But what you'll learn is your work is far from over. After your site,
they literally had a countdown clock. Carrie sent me did a screen share with me at one point that showed on her desktop screen the countdown.
But after your site goes live, the first thing you're going to want to do, obviously, is test it, and test it more and more and more. You'll always want to catch those things before your customers do. And what we did was essentially reperform the beta testing that we had done pre-launch right up front to try to catch those glitches that before the customers did. There will also be some levels of training you want to conduct. Make sure I had the slide open. as there might have been enough lag time between initial training and launch, that kind of learn by doing in the live environment will require more help. Be prepared to do as much training as needed to get the staff comfortable using those new tools and interfaces. And provide documentation for your staff, and this is one of the areas which our current vendor is really strong, so that's a really great thing to have. We also have procedures for each department on our internal wiki as a staff resource that they can refer back to about how to use the new tools. You also want to verify that all integrations and deposits are working properly, so that's PubMed, CrossRef, Discovery Services, etc. Your vendor will tell you that they're working, but you will actually want to talk to the vendors and visit their sites to get reassurance for yourself that they are working. And then an example of that is what I was referring to earlier about PubMed, not linking 6,000 of our articles, which we found by visiting their site. Let's see. After you go live, this is the first opportunity that you and your compositor have to submit and publish new content to the new platform. Make sure your staff are QAing that content very closely to make sure the content is presenting as it should and that all necessary metadata are displaying properly. This is a learning process for your compositor as well, so giving them feedback in these early stages is really important.
And I would add here, get your stakeholders' expectations leveled around the content publication process in that first period after post-launch. So if you're a society and you have close relationships with your editors, get them clued in. For me, it was making our journal editorial manager understand this so that he could explain it to our journal editors. It's rough. There's only so much you're going to figure out through the process that you've gone through. It's only when real content is hitting the site in real time that truly strange things start to pop up. Mm-hmm. And it takes time to figure out. It's all new to everybody. It takes time to figure out, is this a gap in the platform? Is it a gap in the content model? Is it mistagging? And getting it fixed. And we've had some journal editors who very reasonably don't understand why suddenly it's taking longer to get things and they don't look quite as right as they used to.
Yeah, and a lot of our editorial team in-house has been working at APS forever, and so they weren't used to this change either. And the first time somebody saw our new site, they were like, I can't find anything. They completely freaked out. So they're, depending on what staff you have in-house, there may be a lot of hand-holding throughout the process. Change is hard for people. So, all that training is really going to pay off. More training, better. You also have accumulated for post-launch a to-do list. So those things are fixes that you just didn't have time for pre-launch and weren't super important that you needed them for launch, but they will build up over time, and so you will use a lot of that post-launch time kind of catching up those things, and you will have a lot of those things to do. Watch your traffic and analyze your usage stats after you launch. This can be an indication of some problem spots, and so if you're analyzing that traffic very closely, you can catch some things.
And also, well, this is your next point about re-engaging users.
Oh, yeah. For example, we were watching Google Analytics very closely, and that in turn turned into discussions with Google and Google Scholar as to how we could boost our traffic. So at launch, you won't necessarily see a spike in your traffic that you think you might see or want to see. So that was another one of our sort of learning points. And speaking of usage, there are certain pockets of users that you might have been disconnected from at launch for a variety of reasons. They didn't update their bookmarks, they aren't signed up for your new alerts, and re-engaging with them through various communication channels is really important. There are a number of ways to do this, but having a solid communication plan in place during the migration and post-launch is really important for driving this smooth and timely fashion.
Yeah, it was not technically possible for us to migrate our email alert subscribers. So we lost 15 years worth of email alert subscribers. And so a big post-launch effort for us was getting the word out in any way we could, trying to drive them to the new site to sign up again. So these are people that we don't have a business relationship with other than that, and that relationship is managed through the platform, not in our back-end business system. So that was a big effort.
How many did you lose a lot of subscribers that way?
Well, we lost
Yeah.
all of our email alert. I haven't checked lately. Probably nowhere near as many, because I'm telling you, they've been signing up for 15 years and just ignore them or send them into junk
A lot
mail.
of those email addresses were bad anyway,
Yeah.
because they had signed up like 15 years ago.
Yeah.
Can you explain why did you not export the email addresses, or
So,
what caused that?
that's a good question, and I will try to dredge it up. Okay. We had email addresses, and we had what alerts they were signed up to. But we couldn't sign them up automatically on the new system.
Like from a technical reason, or from
We couldn't establish they needed to have a user account to have an alert on the new platform, and we couldn't establish user accounts for them.
Yeah, our old system, we were on the same system before, and that old system is people didn't have to sign up for an account to get alerts. That all they had to do was put in their email address. So
Which is
that's all we
great.
had on them.
That drives tons of alert signups. But yeah.
Okay. You will also start to develop a list of site improvements you will want to make based on user feedback. Perhaps something wasn't working exactly the way you thought it would, or you have ideas on how to make a certain feature even better. You'll want to prioritize those, fixes you can make sooner or later, or things you should put on your roadmap for future development. And finally, something we did at APS, not only to put more clarity on how the project went overall, but it also helped us in having an understanding of how we could work better together internally, is we held a post-mortem on how the project went. We met with all of the teams to obtain feedback and lessons learned, and this is kind of how I was able to prepare this talk. We have a lot of large projects coming up in the future, so being able to understand how we could work better together and make better use of our time and work together on deadlines and things like that was really helpful for us moving forward.
Yeah. And then finally, post-launch, supporting and communicating with customers. And that sounds kind of warm and fuzzy, but what this meant in reality for us was being extremely proactive, or as proactive as we knew how to be, emailing our institutional subscriber admins and saying, we know this is wrong. It's okay. We know it. We're working on it.
Yeah.
We're working really hard. We'll let you know when there's new news. So what we found out, that was very much appreciated, that there's a certain level of understanding that not everything is going to go smoothly. And so if that is the case, then our partners just wanted to hear from us and know that we were, one, aware of it so that they didn't feel like they had to report it and report it again and again and again. And two, that sense that it was being worked on.
And Duke also had a really good communication plan in general. I don't know if you want to talk about it, but it seemed like you were really in touch with your, especially institutions, throughout the whole process, and that really helped in communicating with them and telling them at the end, hey, we've been in touch with you this entire time, and now that we've finally launched, this is what's going on. So I signed up for their alerts, so I knew what was going on.
That's all Kristen and her colleagues. So, okay.
All right, so moving on.
All right. So so finally we're at lessons learned, and we're going to try to be brief about this because I want us to get into the conversation portion.
And we've brought a lot of these up
we've brought
already,
a lot of these up.
So, as we mentioned before, there's no such thing as starting too soon. The more planning you do, the better.
Know your blind spots. These are those black boxes or those things that you may think you know but you don't know enough about. Just question everything. You have no idea until, getting the on-site presentations is great because if you really have been with one platform for a long time, that's your opportunity to see how different the world can be. And it was mind-blowing. And even that didn't shine a light on all of our blind spots. So run an in-house exercise to say, what could we just be taking fundamentally for granted that needs to be said?
And stick to your deadlines at every stage, or testing will suffer. A lot of times, if you're not meeting your deadlines, things get taken away towards the end of the process, and that really cuts into your testing time, and you really need that time to test. So that's why it's so important to keep those deadlines early on, because it will bite you later if you don't.
Give into the time box.
Start early on any custom integrations, so anything out of the box. One example of this is APS integrated with our membership management system. And so we actually started work on that earlier than planned, and that really helped us in the end because we needed that extra time to get this custom integration set up. So that's just one example. But anything custom, get it early in the schedule.
Do a deep dive on all of that intersection of customer, product, and data. And not only on the data, like, okay, how are the rules and how is the data getting passed back and forth, but also on the interfaces. I think one thing we just ran out of time in our project to do was really understand what the librarian's admin interface on the site was going to look like to them. I mean, we'd had pictures of the system, but not what our data was going to look like in the system. And we've been scrambling around that in particular. I wish, in retrospect, that we had said that we had done this much earlier and in much greater detail and not just been like, I'm sure it'll be fine. This has happened for different customers again and again. No big deal. It was a big deal.
Expect your back content to be a mess. And it will be. You think that your metadata is perfect and crystal clear, and it won't be. For example, we discovered that there are 3 years of our content for one journal for a couple journals that was actually duplicated content for each journal. And we're like, why was this the way it is? And it turns out that was another journal at one time with a different title and a different ISSN. So we had to plan for that. Like, what do we do with this? We also had missing content. So we actually were running to the National Library of Medicine to scan print content that we're just missing from our site. So those types of things are going to crop up in a project like this.
That's a good segue to being ready for content fixes and consequences. So you've got to be ready to act. You've got to be ready to get down to the NLM and fire up that scanner. You've got to be, even if that wasn't what you planned to do with your day, you've got to be ready to find out that there is this huge inconsistency or gap, and then how are you going to address it? And you've got a couple of options. Are you going to work with your content conversion vendor to find sort of a blanket programmatic fix? If you are, that's going to break some things. It may fix 80% of your problem and leave 20% untouched and break 10% of something else. And it may still be the right thing to do. You just have to know the risks you're taking when you make these. Are you going to dive into each individual XML file and fix it by hand? Are you going to pay someone to do that? How much time do you have? You've got to be ready to make these kinds of calls kind of on the fly. No, go ahead.
Okay. Involve librarians in the process, and we've talked a lot about this, and you'll be hearing from the librarians later in this session, but it's just so important to involve them in the process. RFP, testing, they're your customers if you're a society publisher, so you definitely want to make sure that your platform is to their spec as well. So. Yeah, Google makes the rules, so listen to them.
And they don't make the rules crystal clear.
Exactly, and this goes beyond, you'll hear that your abstract needs to be above the fold, but it really goes beyond that. There are rules that you may not even be aware of that you have to follow, and so you just have to make sure that your site, upholds those rules and make sure that your site is the most crawler-friendly as possible. And I'll shout out a name here. Darcy Dapra at Google Scholar is a really great resource for this. So she's helped us a lot through this process.
Yeah, and I mean, I think because we're larger, we were definitely on their radar. But if you're not, and Darcy reached out to say, hey, I hear you're migrating, let's start talking. If you're not, Darcy's ready to take that call any day.
She's great. She's fantastic. All right, be prepared for traffic changes. As I had talked about earlier, you will want to see that spike in your traffic right away, but that won't necessarily happen. And each vendor counts its downloads differently, so you can't necessarily gauge your new traffic against your old in a really meaningful way. So, yeah, I don't know if you had that same experience.
Well, we didn't even try to compare traffic because we knew we were losing so many email subscribers, and we didn't know what that was going to represent and the differences. So we just concentrated on doing all we could to drive traffic once it was up. And I think we'll benchmark coming up soon. And then finally, provide strong leadership on this project, empower that leadership. Make sure that leadership is willing to be the bad guy or gal. I think Carrie and I both talked about how at different times we were not well liked. That was okay.
I was ready for vacation just because of that. And you're sending out a ton of emails to your team as well, and they probably get so sick of hearing from you, but they need to hear from you, and you need to let them know that your emails are important, and so pay attention.
And if you don't have a strong leader who's trusted, the team is going to freak out. If they don't feel like somebody's got this in hand, it is extremely chaotic when you are in the midst of it. And if you don't have someone that you're like, you know what, it's chaotic, but I trust that that leader is got it under control or is going to tell me when I need to do something, then again, even if you're annoying them, they feel better. Okay, so that is the overview, and I'm going to go back to lessons learned for this, but I just wanted to make sure that you get our email addresses. I'm also in the Whova app if you want to find me for any follow-up questions that you may have. But we've got 10 minutes for just questions and comments. Rob, go ahead. Hold that thought.
Oh, sorry.
Gotta get the recording, people.
Rob O'Donnell, Rockefeller University Press. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about the process you guys used to discover missing content in the first place.
That was mainly because our new vendor sent us a script of things that were missing. And so we had a whole spreadsheet to go by that our vendors could hand us and say, this content isn't there. Do you have it? Can you give it to us? So that's basically how we found it.
We didn't have that, and I wish we did. I was just so naive. I was like, why would we be missing content? And we were missing content at every levels. We launched and we got reports of like, this whole issue's not there, or the PDF of this article's not there, or the supplemental. It was like at every level. So go ahead, you had more to say.
No, so I understand pieces missing, but the list that, Carrie, that you just described, where did the master list come from?
So they just were able to determine by our volume and issues and how those sequences ran throughout our content. This looks like a gap. Is this a gap, or was this how things were numbered in that particular year? So they were able to go by patterns, and I think that was pretty much the way they did it.
Because we had that in-house archive, I was able, by hook or by crook, it's not fancy, it was just a file. It was actually in SharePoint. I was able to download a lot of the metadata that we had built around the files, around the assets, and sort of extract out of that for each journal, from the first volume to the last volume, following the logical sequence of numbering. I was able to extract out of that every issue. My visibility stopped at that level.
And just to build off of what Allison said really quickly, from once we got deeper than issue, then we really did rely on librarians saying, we can't find this.
And discovery services who get really grumpy when something that they once had in their database no longer resolves.
Were those files missing from the original platform, or did they disappear as part of the migration?
It was mostly that they were just missing throughout our history, that they were never on the platform. I can't think of any instances where they just got lost in the shuffle during migration. Maybe a few of them, but mostly it was missing from the start.
So would it be possible to run a script or something before the migration to discover those?
If you could in-house, yeah. Or maybe your current host can do that for you, but I would certainly try, because if you can determine those gaps early, that would be super helpful, because we were scrambling.
And this goes back to building your archive now before you need to migrate, and then you have time to go through it all. It may take a year to get down to the article level, but if you do that now, you have time.
Yeah, it can help if you have your content repository in-house, such that your platform is not your repository, they're just the host. So that way you have all the knowledge of what files you should have rather than the platform.
Yeah. And our content dated back to 1898, and so it's understandable that we may miss some things, like, this issue from 1912 is missing. Do you have it? It's hard to discover those things if you don't have a script.
And I'm going to get up on one of my long-standing hobby horses here, and Bernie is going to laugh. So if you do book publishing at any level and you need to send ebooks out into the world, there is this service well established with multiple vendors in the marketplace called digital asset distribution. Like Ingram Core Source in the university press community. There's BiblioVault. I think Code Mantra does this. I'm sure there are others now. But basically, you get all of your ebook and print digital assets for your books into one place, so that when you need to do a short-run digital print, you can send those files to a printer. You can send your ebook files to Amazon and Sony and whoever else. This does not exist for journal publishing. And I have been talking to everyone who could possibly enter this space about doing it, and it still doesn't exist. So it is up to you to build this content archive in-house. And since we do have books and I do use these systems, what we have for our in-house archive is woefully inadequate to doing the kinds of things we're talking about. If you have a true CMS in-house, bully for you. You'll be in a good position, but we don't. So please, someone build a digital asset management system for journals.
Craig Griffin from Silverchair. So you knew I was going to say something, right? So one thing I think that was really successful, Allison, was that in all of the many months of conversations that we had leading up to signing a contract, you were able to explain a lot of detail in certain areas where you had a sense of these are things that maybe editorially we do a little bit differently, or some little wrinkles and nuances, and able to really explain that, so that early on, even before we even signed a contract, we knew what those things were, and we knew those places where we had to pay extra attention. The content was going to come in structured a certain way, or associations of that nature. So that was extremely helpful. And having that sort of understanding of what makes Duke different or APS different in certain content areas is really helpful to explain to a vendor, because then they can keep that in mind throughout the process as well. And then the other thing I would say, just in terms of blind spots, is getting into the contracting process can always be really fun. At the end, everyone sort of made the decision to move forward, and then all of a sudden there's a whole bunch of new people on the phone. There's legal, sometimes there's additional executives, there's sometimes additional departments, depending on the size of your organization, and contracting can take quite a bit of time.
Craig, are you scarred?
No. I did think we were having Christmas dinner together.
Yeah, I know. Christmas Eve and New Year's Eve, Craig and I were. Yeah, Duke Legal was no fun. No, I'm sorry, not Duke Legal. Duke OIT Security, Duke E-commerce Division, Duke Legal, Corporate Risk, Procurement. It was bad. If you are a small society that is self-governed, God bless you.
Yeah, it varies widely, but generally the larger the organization, the more new voices on the phone as you get closer to signing something. And so that's just something to keep in mind.
Yeah. And to echo what Craig said first, know where you're different. So even if you're an STM publisher and you're like, hey, everybody's been doing this for 25 years, you're different somewhere. And it matters a whole lot to you and your editors and your authors and your members. So know where you're different and make sure to highlight that in those conversations.
And a lot of those know where you're different things are also custom integrations. So those are the things you need to start on very early in the process.
Yeah.
One of the things, how we're different from, and it was kind of surprising that we're different in this way, but when we moved to a new platform, we wanted our ahead of print content archived. It's citable information. We didn't want it to go away. So that was one of the pieces that we wanted to migrate. Well, on our current platform, the way it usually works is when ahead of print content gets final published, it just goes away. And so we didn't want ours to go away. So they had to build a complete custom system as to how to get that ahead of print content archived once it's published. And that was a bear. That was a complete bear, and we weren't really prepared for how long it would take to get that set up. But it was one of the things we started early, and we were glad we did, because that was a huge project in itself.
Okay, so we're at break time, and we have time at the end of everything for more discussion, and I think it's going to be really interesting to hear how that discussion goes once we have the librarian's perspective out there. So go forth, find your coffee. Please be back at 10 after. We will start promptly.